So if I can use the if-else to create 2 buckets, is there some way that I can have 3 buckets or more than 2 buckets? And Python allows us to use an if, elif. This is what it looks like. If, and we have the traditional condition with the colon, followed by all of the stuff within the bucket. And now I can add a second bucket that has a condition on it, the elif. It is lowercase elif. I have the same semicolon, and I'm going to tab in order to get anything inside of the elif bucket. So, for example, if current time is greater than class time, print you're late for class, elif. The current time is equal to the start time, we're going to print you're right on time. So I can add a condition to the second bucket. All right, so let's practice an if, elif. So I'm going to ask the user for their name. I'm going to put it in a variable called your name. Once I have their name, I'm going to compare it to their hummingbird's name using an if statement. And if they are the same, I'm going to print something like, did you do that on purpose? Then I'm going to flush my cursor to the left, and we're going to type in an elif, which is going to allow me to have another condition. This time, I'm going to say if your name is equal to Speedy, we want to print something like that's not very original. And then I'm going to make sure my cursor is flushed to the left because I want to test this. So if I want to enter or drop into the first bucket, I'm going to need to make sure that my hummingbird's name is the same as my name. So if my hummingbird's name is James, then my name is also going to have to be James so that I can execute the first bucket. Did you do that on purpose? If I want the second bucket to execute, the elif, I'm going to have to make sure that my name is Speedy and then my name is not the same as my hummingbird's name. So my hummingbird's name is James. I'm going to say that my name is capital Speedy, and I should be able to drop into the second bucket. So I can have 2 buckets. Both of them can have conditions on them, the if and the elif. But we already found out that the if has an optional default value called the else. And so we can actually create 3 buckets now using an if, elif, else. Once again, the if is going to have a condition. I can add the elif with its condition, and then I can add the default else at the very end. As always, the else doesn't have a condition. Obviously, if my the if condition is true, then the if statements will execute. Otherwise, it's going to evaluate the condition on the elif. If that is true, it will execute the elif. And if neither one of those 2 execute, then the else at the very bottom, the default value will execute. So here's an example of it. If you are a senior or a junior, we're going to print the time has come to register. Elif, you're a sophomore or a freshman, we're going to print get ready to register. And else, that is everybody else who didn't drop into one of those first 2 buckets, it's going to print, are you a student here? So let's practice that. So how about if we practice it on the if, elif that we're using your name. And if I add a default else here on the end, if it didn't drop into the first or the second bucket, it's going to do whatever I put inside of this if bucket. And what I'm going to do is put in there, nice to meet you, James. And I'll comma separate that from your name. So let's test that. Say my name is James. My hummingbird's wings beat at 25. Your name is George. And I have dropped into the else bucket. So let's do it again because we're having so much fun. This time I'm going to find out how much your hummingbird weighs. We're going to use an if, elif, else. And if you don't mind, I'm going to push that down a little bit so I can see it. We're going to ask for the hummingbird's weight. I'll put it in a variable called weight. I do want to force it to be a float because I'm going to use it numerically. And And then I'm going to ask, how much does Speedy weigh? I would like to put the name of the hummingbird inside of that input statement. So I'm going to say, how much does Speedy weigh? Well, if I were to build that print statement inside of my input, I know that this how much does is going to be inside of the text field, so I'll copy and paste that. And then I'm going to use the plus sign or the concatenation operator to concatenate that with the name of my hummingbird. And then I'm going to use the concatenation operator to get that last thing called weight. But because I'm using a concatenation operator and not the comma separator gives me spaces, but the concatenation doesn't. And so I'm going to have to force some spaces inside of my text field if I don't want all the words to be mashed up next to one another. So I'm going to say if their weight is greater than 4.5, and I'm going to assume that this is grams, I'm going to print something like Speedy weighs more than a nickel. And then I'm going to flush my cursor to the left, and I'm going to add an elif with another condition. If the weight is equal to 3.0 grams, we're going to imply grams. Elif weight is equal to 3, and then I'll press my enter key and it will tab me in, and it will say I'm going to print Speedy is the average weight of a hummingbird. And then I'll add the default else on the end. Remember, the else doesn't need a condition. If it doesn't fall into the first bucket and it doesn't fall into the second bucket, it will automatically execute the third. I'm going to print something like, are you sure you entered the correct weight? And I'm going to mirror the weight back to the user. So let me drag this off to the side so I can get a little bit of space, and then I am going to mirror that back just by displaying the field. All right, so we have another if, elif, else. Let's see if we can get the first one to execute. This is going to require, I should probably spell weight correctly. Looks like I cannot consistently spell weight right. All right, so if the weight is more than 4.5, then we should be able to drop into the first bucket. So let me execute this. And it asks me, how much does James weigh? And I see I spelled weight wrong even in my field. Let's say that James weighs more than 4.5. So if I put 5 in there, it should say James weighs more than a nickel. So let me try it one more time, and this we're going to see if we can drop into the elif bucket. How much does George weigh? This time he would have to weigh exactly 3. And it says George is the average weight of a hummingbird. And the only way that I'm going to get inside of the other bucket is if he doesn't drop into one of the two. And that means that his weight would have to be 4.5 or less, but not 3. So let's say that I put how much does he weigh? Let me put 2.0 in there. It says, are you sure you entered the correct weight? And it's going to mirror back that weight to the user. So the one problem that I can see with this program is that if his weight is more than 4.5, it's going to tell him he weighs more than a nickel. But if his weight is 4.4, actually if his weight is exactly 4.5 or less, it's going to say, are you sure you entered the correct weight? Unless his weight is 3.0, which means that I have this gap between 4.5 and 3. And what I would really like to do is have another bucket in there that allows me to catch anything between 4.5 and 3. And if you might imagine, I can add another elif. Each time I add an elif, it allows me to add another bucket. So I can say if, elif, 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 else, with the else at the default on the end. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come inside of here and I'm going to add another elif. And I would really like to be able to add that elif to catch the weights between 3 and 4.5. So I'm going to add an elif that says if weight is less than or equal to 4.5 and weight is greater than 3, and then I'm going to we'll print James is a heavy hummingbird. So, as you might imagine, I can have more than one elif between the if and the else. And each time I add an elif, it allows me to have another bucket that I can put a condition on. So let's test this one and see if we actually do have 4 buckets. The first bucket is if my hummingbird weighs more than a nickel, more than 4.5, I'm going to put 4.6. It says James weighs more than a nickel. The next bucket is if he weighs exactly 4.5 or more than 3. So let's see if we can put something between 4.5 and 3. So I'll put 3.5 and it should tell me that he is heavy. The third bucket should be exactly 3. So if I put exactly 3.0, I drop into that third bucket. And then the last one is if he doesn't drop into any of the other buckets, it will automatically execute the else. So that would be anything that is less than 3.0, such as 2.9. So let's do this one more time, practicing if, elif, else. I'm going to come down here, I'm going to flush my cursor to the left, and then I'm going to push it down just a little bit to give myself some room. And this time we are going to ask, I want to make sure my cursor is flushed to the left, we're going to ask how fast does your heart beat? And so I'm going to put that in a variable called heart rate. So we're going to practice the if, elif, else. I'm going to create a variable called heart rate, and I'm going to ask, I would like that value to be an integer, and so I'm going to read my input directly into the parentheses to force it to be an integer, and I'm going to ask how fast does your heart beat? The first one is if your heart is beating between 20 and 60, then I'm going to print something like you must be doing yoga. So if your heart rate is greater than 20 and heart rate is less than 60, I'm going to print you must be doing yoga, because that is a pretty slow heartbeat. I'm going to add an elif. So elif heart rate is greater than or equal to 60 because I want that boundary value 60 to drop into this bucket. And your heart rate is less than 100. Well, 60 to 100 is a pretty normal heart rate, so I'm going to print something like watching TV. I'm going to add a third elif bucket if your heart rate is more than 100. I'm going to include the 100 greater than or equal to 100, so I can include that 100 boundary value in this third bucket. I'm going to print your heart rate is still not as fast as Speedy's. And then I'm going to print his heartbeats at 1200 beats per minute. Now I don't know if your hummingbird is male or female, so I'm going to come in here and put his or her. And then the last line that I'm going to print is, and she takes approximately 250 breaths per minute. I'm going to flush to the left because the last thing that we wanted to add was that default else. So let's say your heart rate is between 20 and 60, or 60 to 100, or 100 and over. The only other option that we have would be, I'm going to print I zombie with a question mark. Because if your heartbeat, if you didn't drop into one of those 3 buckets, that means that your heart is beating very, very slowly. So let's see if we can test these 4 buckets. So I'm going to put a heart rate between 20 and 60. How fast is your heartbeat? I want it to be 20 and 60, and that's going to be 50. So we should be doing yoga. If I test it again for the second bucket, I need it to be between 60 and 100. So I can include 60 in this test case, but I cannot include 100. So I'm going to put 75, and we should drop into the second bucket, which is watching TV. If I want to test the third one, I need my heart rate to be 100 or more. How fast is my heartbeat? If I make it 100 or more, like 125, it's going to say 125 is still not as fast as James. Her heartbeat's at 1200 beats per minute, and she takes approximately 250 breaths per minute. So you may think that the only thing that I can put inside these if, elif, else buckets are print statements, because up until now, that's pretty much the only thing that we put inside of there. So the last thing that I would like to do for this is to create what is called a nested if statement. So let's see if we can test nested if. I'm going to say something like, if your hummingbird's speed is more than 150 and your heart rate is more than 199, so let me build that one. That means that your hummingbird is moving fast and your heart is beating really fast. I want to print something like, you will probably never catch him. And then I'm going to say something like, put out some sugar. Speedy needs half his body weight of sugar per day. So let me build that print statement. This is what I want it to say. But I want it to say, put out some sugar. Speedy, which is the name of your hummingbird, needs 3 grams of sugar per day. But I don't want it to say 3 grams. I want it to be half of whatever his actual body weight is. So let's see if we can build this print statement. The first thing that we're going to have is a text field. I'm going to comma separated that from the variable called name, which is the name of my bird. The next text field is going to be the word needs. And then that 3.0, that is actually half his body weight. How do I go about calculating half the body weight of my hummingbird? Well, I know what his weight is. If I want to know what half his body weight is, all I have to do is divide it by 2. So I'm going to do a calculation, his weight divided by 2, and then I'm pretty sure that I have one final text field left, which is grams of sugar per day. Put out some sugar. Speedy needs half his body weight, grams of sugar per day. So that is my print statement. So I'm going to drop down here and add an elif. This time I'm going to say, if your hummingbird's name is Speedy or his name is Lightning, I'm going to give him the chance to change the hummingbird's name. So if his name is Speedy or his name is Lightning, I am going to give them a chance to change his name. So I'm going to read input into the hummingbird's name again. And I'm going to say something like, Speedy needs a different name. Enter something more original. And then I'm going to put an if statement. If his name is still Speedy or Lightning, I want to print seriously. And then I'll print, if his name is not Speedy or Lightning, I'm going to add an else on here that says, James is much better. So the purpose of this was to show you that I could nest things, could put things inside of if buckets or elif buckets or else buckets for that matter that are not print statements. I can actually nest if statements inside of other if statements. So let's test this and see what we can come up with. The only way that I'm going to drop into the first bucket is if my hummingbird is flying fast and my heart is beating very quickly. So the question is, how fast do my hummingbird's wings beat? They need to be more than 150, so I'm going to put in 200. And then it's going to ask me, how fast does my heart beat? Well, that needs to be more than 199, so I'm going to put 200 in there. And then it should display to me, you will probably never catch him. Put out some sugar. Gene needs 6 grams of sugar per day. That is because he weighs 3 grams. That's the weight that I put in. To test this last one, my hummingbird's name needs to be either Speedy or Lightning. So I'm going to make his name Speedy. How fast do his wings beat? Well, I'll put him less than 150. So I'll put it in 100. I don't want to accidentally drop in that first bucket. How much does he weigh? How fast does my heart beat? At this point, it doesn't matter. And it says Speedy needs a different name. Enter something more original. I see Speedy is mashed up next to needs, so I'm going to have to force a space in there. If I don't change his name, if I leave it at Speedy, it should print something like seriously. So let me put a space between the name of my hummingbird and the word needs. We'll run it one more time. And this time, I'm going to make his name Speedy at 100 beats per minute. Speedy needs a different name. Enter something more original. So now if I add something more original, it drops me into that else statement inside the elif. So we found out that we can nest other things inside of the if structures.